It was a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1927. The place was Shibe Park, Philadelphia. There were 35,000 excited baseball fans in the stands, all booing one man. Bob Grove, who was probably one of the greatest left-handed pitchers of all time, had just struck Babe Ruth out on 3 pitched balls for the second consecutive time, and 2 runners were left stranded on base. As the great slugger returned to the bench amidst the wild and abusive jeering, he looked up into the stands with an unruffled smile, just as he had the first time he struck out, gave his cap a polite little tip, stepped down into the dugout, and calmly took his drink of water. In the 8th inning, his turn came up again. This time the situation was critical. The Athletics were leading the Yankees 3-1. The bases were loaded, and there were 2 out. It was up to the great Babe Ruth to win the game or lose it. As he selected his favorite bat and started toward the plate, the crowd rose in a body as if by signal. The excitement was tremendous. The crowd wanted Babe Ruth to strike out again. Lefty Grove rifled the first blazing fastball over the plate. Ruth swung and missed. The next pitch was good, and Ruth swung so hard and missed that he staggered and went down. There was a cloud of dust as the big guy sprawled on the ground. The crowd was going mad. The Babe got to his feet, brushed the dust off his trousers, and got set for the next pitch. Grove delivered the fastball. So fast, few of the fans even saw it. Babe swung again, but this time there was a crack like a rifle shot. The ball soared high and far. It cleared the scoreboard and the houses across the street, one of the longest hits ever made in baseball history. As Babe Ruth trotted around the bases and across the plate behind the other runners with what proved to be the winning run, he received a wild ovation from the crowd, the same crowd that had been booing him all afternoon. Babe looked up into the stands, doffed his cap with that same little smile and the same expression on his face exactly like the one he wore on his first 2 trips when he had taken the razzing. Now, later in the season, after the Yankees clinched the pennant, Grantland Rice interviewed Ruth. Babe, he asked, "What do you do when you get in a batting slump?" And Babe answered, "I just keep going up there and keep swinging at 'em. I know the old law of averages will hold good for me the same as it does for anybody else, if I keep having my healthy swings. If I strike out 2 or 3 times in a game or fail to get a hit for a week, why should I worry? Let the pitchers worry. They're the guys who are going to suffer later on." Babe Ruth's unshakable faith in making the law of averages work for him enabled him to accept his bad breaks and failures with a smile. Now, this simple, common-sense philosophy had much to do with making him baseball's greatest showman, biggest box-office attraction, and the highest-paid ball player of all time. He had his faults like the rest of us, but his faith in the law of averages made him great. Now, there's a lesson there for all of us. Babe Ruth hit 851 home runs, as we all know. He struck out 1,330 times. But we don't think about his failures, and neither did he. He kept swinging and knew that the law of averages would take care of the rest. Well, how about you? I think that's another important principle that we might keep in mind, how the law of averages will work for us if we'll stay in there and if we'll keep swinging. We know that one of the most valuable attributes an adult can have is persistence. And a DePaul University psychologist, Dr. Glenn D. Jensen, has found that the best way to develop persistence in a child is to permit him to fail regularly. When we see a young child trying to do something and finding it difficult, and realizing how simply we can help him finish what he's trying to do, we have an almost overwhelming impulse to give him a hand. If we do this too often, it can be a mistake. In the tests conducted by Dr. Jensen, youngsters aged 3 to 9 years were tested in a room equipped with levers and knobs. They learn after a few minutes that twisting one of them will produce marbles, which will be exchanged for pennies. Now, some of the children are purposely spoiled, get marbles every time they twist the knobs. Others get marbles only after a number of knob twists. Then Jensen cuts off the marbles entirely and begins measuring the children's persistence. Now, white rats also are used in the experiments. The psychologist divides the white rats into 2 groups, those to be spoiled with kindness and those to be disappointed. Now, those to be spoiled are placed in a small cell with a single bar, which, when pressed, produces a tiny pellet of food. The second group finds it harder to come by. The first time they press the bar, it produces, but the next pellet comes only after 5 presses. Then this is raised by geometric progression to 10, 20, 40, 80, and 160. The graphs show that the spoiled rats lose heart quickly when they discover that they will not get food each time. But the frequently disappointed rats keep at it. It seems that the reaction of the children is just about the same as that of the rats, which all goes to prove, what you probably knew already, that a life full of rewards is less a spur to sticking with the job than if it's interlaced with disappointment. When asked if young humans act like laboratory animals in these tests, the university said the answer seems to be yes. So it would appear then that the wise mother or father is not the one who says, "Here, let me help you with that," but instead understands the importance of failure. Failure keeps us trying. Easy success tends to cause us to give up the first time that we're faced with a job that takes persistence. Now, this is probably why the most popular sports and games are those most difficult to master. This must be why millions of men go back to golf each year, knowing that it's one of the most difficult games to get good at. The same would apply to the universal popularity of tennis, bridge, marriage, politics, and statesmanship. But the purpose in my mentioning these tests with youngsters and white rats, if you can forget the invidious comparison, is that we need to fail if we're to develop persistence. And maybe we shouldn't be so quick to give the kids a hand when they find themselves stumped on a problem. A bright, personable young man had been offered the opportunity to work for a highly successful, well-established manufacturing company. He saw the personnel director, talked with other officers of the company, and finally requested an interview with the company's president and chairman of the board. And this is how the president himself tells the story of what happened. The young man said he was considering an offer to join our company. He wanted to be certain he was making the right lifetime choice, and he felt he had a right to research this question right up to the chairman of the board. He was intelligent, ambitious, and appeared to have good potential for growth. In fact, the company president went on to say, "I caught myself speculating as to whether or not he might run the company in 20 years. However, his line of questioning was disappointing. It suggested that his goal was personal security and not opportunity. He was interested not in our problems and probable growth, but in our rate of employee turnover, in our fringe benefits, and in our pension plan, to a point where it became apparent to me that he wanted to spend his working days in an atmosphere of maximum personal security, and not in a dynamic environment of exploiting our opportunities. I felt I had an obligation to place this matter in focus, and he appeared shocked when I told him that I was sure he could not find security in our company, because I'd been looking for it for some time and couldn't find it myself. I told him that it was frequently necessary for us to make major strategic decisions with respect to product, key personnel, pricing, expansion, and the like, and that despite our excellent staff, our sound product position, and our financial strength, a major error could relegate all of our personal security programs to the ash can. I reminded him, for example, that products can be obsoleted by research and invention, conducted in some remote basement in the world, which would have the effect of rendering unnecessary our plants, facilities, personnel, and even management. I also reminded him that this not only could happen, but has happened many times. I told him that there was no absolute security in our company or any other company, except that which our personnel collectively earned from day to day and from year to year, and that furthermore there was no absolute security for him in our company unless he remained competitive in his work until the day of his retirement. And finally, I suggested that in planning his life work, that he place major emphasis on exploiting opportunities for growth, with their attendant successes and failures, rather than on personal security in and of itself. Well, unfortunately, he behaved like the young man reported in the Gospel who asked the Lord what he might do to gain eternal life. When he heard the answer, and considering it too hard, he silently went away. Morbid emphasis on personal security generates a certain myopia, a dedication to the status quo, resistance to change, and the rejection of opportunities for personal growth with their associated risks and rewards because there might be a finite chance to fail. And he closed with this thought: I've learned over the years that preoccupation with security breeds insecurity, and that security, like happiness, most often eludes those who pursue it the most. Paradoxically, security most often comes to him who in life assumes the risks of insecurity. The other day in a taxi, I felt amusing about the story, A Connecticut Yankee. Maybe you're old enough to remember the movie with Will Rogers. In the story, he's struck by lightning or some such thing and finds himself magically transported back in time to the days of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. And I began trying to think of something I could teach the people if the same thing happened to me. And it poses an interesting question. If you were suddenly transported back in time, say 1,000 years, what could you teach the thinking people of that time? You would know So much that they still hadn't dreamed of: the airplane, an automobile, electricity, and a telephone, printing, gunpowder, atomic energy, the steam engine, the propeller. If you were taken back to the year 1000 A.D., what could you teach them? For one thing, it'll make you realize how little you really know. However, if you could manage to keep from being burned as a sorcerer, the wise men of the time would make pilgrimages to see you and ask thousands of questions. You would be the most famous person on earth and the most celebrated. You'd be 400 years ahead of Gutenberg in his discovery of movable type and printing, 600 years ahead of Galileo, 500 years ahead of Columbus. But with all of your knowledge of our modern world and its thousands of wonders, what could you show them how to do? The aspirin tablet, the first real wonder drug and painkiller, would have been an unbelievable boon to them in their suffering. Could you show them how to make it? How to mix saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur to produce gunpowder? How about the steam engine? Could you show them how to make one? Or a simple electrical generator? Or how to make wire? Could you make a clock? Or a still to refine kerosene and gasoline from crude oil? We know so much about so many thousands of things, but with the exception of our specialty, we'd be hard-pressed to teach them how to really make much of anything. Some of our scientists could, but it is said that there's not a man alive in the world today who could single-handedly put together an operating automobile starting from scratch. Now, this makes for a fascinating conversation. You can try it with your family at dinner. The kids will love it. It makes them realize how interdependent we are, that we couldn't do a thing without the help of thousands, millions of other people. Everything we have comes from other people. We didn't have to build our own home or make the family car or cut wood for the fire or haul water from the well or grow our own vegetables, raise our own chickens or livestock, or make our own clothes or furniture and cooking utensils, write and print our own books and newspapers, or even provide for our own entertainment. And the most interesting discussion can center around what we know enough about to teach to others if we should suddenly find ourselves without the help of our modern society, without modern medicine and dentistry, communication and transportation, educational facilities and modern utilities. I was reading that great little book, The Ever-Present Past, by the late Edith Hamilton, certainly one of the greatest ladies who ever lived, and I came across something I thought you'd like. When I read educational articles, she wrote, it often seems to me that the purely personal side of education is not emphasized enough. The fact that it's so much more agreeable and interesting to be an educated person than not. The sheer pleasure of being educated does not seem to be stressed anymore. Once long ago, I was talking with Professor Basil L. Gildersleeve of Johns Hopkins University, the greatest Greek scholar our country has produced. He was an old man, and he'd been honored everywhere, in Europe as well as in America. He was just back from a celebration held for him in Oxford, and I asked him what compliment received in his long life had pleased him most. The question amused him, and he laughed over it, and he thought too, and finally he said, well, I believe it was when one of my students said, Professor, you have so much fun with your own mind. Robert Louis Stevenson said that a man ought to be able to spend 2 or 3 hours waiting for a train at a little country station when he was all alone and had nothing to read, and not be bored for a moment. What is the education which can do this? What is the furniture which makes the only place belonging absolutely to each one of us, the world within, a place where we like to go? I wish I could answer that question. I wish I could produce a perfect decorator's design warranted to make any interior lovely and interesting and stimulating, but even if I could, sooner or later we would certainly try different designs. My point is only that while we must and should change the furniture, we ought to throw away old furniture very cautiously. It may turn out to be irreplaceable. The world within, a place where we like to go. How about that? That's the aim of education, and it should be the aim of every person, to make his world within a place where he likes to go. And what about Robert Louis Stevenson's comment that a person ought to be able to spend 2 or 3 hours waiting for a train at a little country station when he's all alone and had nothing to read, and not be bored for a moment? Stand some evening in a big city at 5 o'clock and watch the faces of the scrambling, frenetic crowd, people hurrying home, trying to shorten the time they're left to their own devices and their own thoughts. But they are not our problem. We are our problem. Our own inner worlds are our problems. How's yours? Edith Hamilton was right. The purely personal side of a good education, an education available to every one of us, is not emphasized enough. Not enough of us understand the fact that it's so much more agreeable and interesting to be an educated person than not. We should all be concerned every day with the furnishings we're selecting for our inner worlds. A poet hundreds of years before Plato said, "Before the gates of excellence, the high gods have placed sweat. Long is the road thereto, and steep and rough at the first, but when the height is won, then there is ease." My old friend Dr. L.D. Pankey of Coral Gables, Florida, recently returned from a trip through the Orient. All the time he and Betty were abroad, they kept me up to date on their travels with the unique and interesting newsletter they send back to their stay-at-home friends whenever they're traveling, which is, well, for a couple of months every year. I received a letter from him the other day asking me when I was going to come down to Florida and join him in some bone fishing in the Keys. In answering his letter, I remembered something that had happened in his office many years ago that had made a deep impression on me. I was looking at a picture of one of the classes that he conducts each year for men of his profession from all over the world. And in studying the photograph, I realized that I was seeing some of the same faces I'd seen in other photographs of earlier classes he'd held. So I said, "I noticed many of the same people took your course this year who took it a year ago. What did you teach this year that you didn't teach last year?" And his reply surprised me. He said, "Nothing. I teach the same thing every year, not only in this country but abroad as well. Oh, I add to it each year as I learn new things, but basically it's the same course every year." Well, I was amazed. "Do you mean you teach the same things to the same people all over again?" "That's right," he answered. And seeing my surprise, he laughed and asked me a question that stopped me completely. He said, "When you find your golf game isn't as good as you'd like it to be, or suddenly find the ball isn't going where you want it to go, and you can't put your finger on what's wrong, what do you do?" I told him, "Well, I go back to the pro for some lessons." He said, "That's right. And what does he teach you? Does he teach you something new about the game, something you didn't know at some time before? Or does he merely remind you once again of the basic fundamentals, which, if you'll but be guided by them, will result in your getting the kind of score you'll be happy with?" Well, he had me, and it made me remember the old saying that we need reminding as much as we need educating. That's why these principles are so important. It applies to becoming good at anything. It's as important to living successfully as it is to playing a satisfactory game of golf or practicing medicine or dentistry. We need to be reminded from time to time, and the more regularly the better, of the basics, the fundamentals upon which everything else is built. The good home may look different from all the other homes on the street, but its foundation followed the rules for any good foundation, and so did its construction. Do it right the first time, and it'll stand for as long as we need it. If we build our lives and what we do during our days on truth and justice, we'll build the kind of lives we can be proud of, that will take us to the goals we seek in good time without worry or frustration. But we do need reminding. You might remember that bit about the golf pro. He doesn't teach you anything new, but he reminds you of some of the basics you've forgotten and helps you rid yourself of some bad habits. No matter what it is a person does, if he does it too long without a break of some kind, he's apt to get off the track. He loses his objectivity. Experts in various fields have been in them so long they forget what they're trying to do. This is why the book written by the learned professor is often written to win the approval of other learned professors. As a result, it doesn't amount to much because nobody reads it but learned professors who already know everything that's in it. Nobody who needs it and could learn from it can get interested in it even if he can understand it. Take the field of advertising. It all started as a means of getting people to buy products. It's a form of salesmanship. But so many advertising people have been in advertising for so long, it sometimes seems they've forgotten the real purpose, and they've lost touch with the people they're supposed to motivate. Whit Hobbs, senior vice president in charge of creative services at Benton and Bowles, made a speech some time back, in which he urged a return to honest fundamentals, and he asked his audience if, when they sit down to write or judge an ad, they set their standards as high as they could and should be. He said, "You say to yourself, if this doesn't sell me, excite me, arouse or amuse or interest or challenge or help or befriend me, how the heck is it going to sell other people?" He said that other people aren't different. He said they're smart like you, and savvy and hurried and harried and concerned and confused, just like you. Too many kids, not enough money, worried about crabgrass and Congress and college and communists and constipation. Their upper sinuses are clogged, and so are their septic tanks, just like yours. He said they're great people, just like you. Get to know them better. You can't help liking them. Stop feeding them pap. They've outgrown it years ago. Start talking up to them. That's the way they want to be talked to. Stop beating them over the head. Stop boring them. He said, give them bright, bold, friendly, helpful, challenging, entertaining advertising that customers like. From you and me, he went on to say, with regard to advertising, they want friendship and understanding and sympathy and help. They want quality, quality, quality. Why don't we give it to them? In speaking of the run-of-the-mill, ridiculous, insulting advertising, Hobbes said, why do we have the same dull housewife in the same dull kitchen, with the same totally inept husband and the same know-it-all mother in every commercial, and those same unattractive people sitting around the table grinning all through breakfast every morning? Where do we find people like this? People so stupid they can sit there and eat a whole meal and not even know there's an announcer standing right there in the room with them. Where do we find those models in car ads, those tall, gawky, empty-headed, flat-chested girls standing there with silly, gaudy clothes on and plumes in their hair and feet spread way apart like they had an itch, staring adoring at the new car? Why don't we try to win customers instead of prizes? It's true. Spend too much time doing the same job, and if you don't get off once in a while and take a good, long, objective look at what you're doing, you can lose touch completely, get completely off on the wrong track. The last couple of days I've been reading a book that's been in my library for many years. It was written, I believe, in 1935 and is possibly now out of print. It's Man the Unknown by Dr. Alexis Carrel, the great Nobel Prize-winning physician who died in 1944. He writes that the happiest and most useful men consist of a well-integrated whole. This would also apply to women, of course. Consist of a well-integrated whole of intellectual, moral, and organic activities. The quality of these activities and their equilibrium gives to such a type its superiority over the others. The development of complete human beings must be the aim of our efforts. It is only with such thoroughly developed individuals that a real civilization can be constructed. And then he says, there's also a class of people who, although as disharmonious as the criminal and the insane, are indispensable to modern society. They are the people of genius. They are characterized by a monstrous growth of some of their psychological activities. A great artist, a great scientist, a great philosopher is rarely a great man. He is generally a man of common type, with one side overdeveloped. Genius can be compared to a tumor growing upon a normal organism. And these ill-balanced beings are often unhappy, but they give to the entire community the benefit of their mighty impulses. Their disharmony results in the progress of civilization. Humanity has never gained anything from the efforts of the crowd. It is driven onward by the passion of a few abnormal individuals, by the flame of their intelligence, by their ideal of science, of charity, and of beauty. Interesting thought, isn't it? The happiest and most useful people consist of a well-integrated whole. These are those beautifully balanced people with good or even fine minds, great interests in a wide variety of pursuits, who are, as a result, seldom bored, seldom depressed. They look out toward the world and its infinite variety of interesting and exciting ideas and events. They seldom look inward upon themselves, but when they do, they're quite happy with what they find. Now, this is not to say that the well-balanced person cannot be a genius. Many are. Dr. Carrel's men of genius, characterized by a monstrous growth of some overpowering and consuming and, as a result, overbalancing talent, are more than just geniuses. He's writing about the great artists, the great scientists, and the great philosophers who appear on the world stage so rarely. In these people, it seems that all the strength-giving alloys have been withheld, leaving only the rare and pure single metal of their makeup. And while they shine like the rare stars they are because of their purity, they suffer terribly from their lack of wholeness. Whenever they step off the one substance that gives meaning to their lives, they must fall into the chasm caused by their lack of footing in every other direction. But while I'm sure they suffer, they must also know a corresponding joy and elation at times, far above anything enjoyed by their well-balanced and generally happier brothers. And they do drive humanity onward. The development of complete human beings must be the aim of our efforts, and a good place to begin is with ourselves. And it's good to go back sometimes to the old books in our old libraries. Mr. Frederick C. Decker, publisher of Printers, Inc., gave some wonderful advice in his fine magazine some time back to all of us who are engaged in business, to all humans, in fact, who work. It appeared in his editorial called A Publisher's View and was titled, Why Are You in Business? And it goes like this. If someone abruptly asks you, why is your company in business, what would you say, and how long would it take you to say it? Unless you're different from many people I know, your first reaction to such a question is apt to be a near total loss of words, and your second one is just as apt to be a series of attempted answers that you will reject one by one as either wholly inadequate or so involved that you'll want to withdraw them until you can sharpen them up. If you don't believe this, assume I'm asking you right now why your company is in business, and then sit back and see how fast you can produce an answer with which you're thoroughly satisfied. A marketing manager and his agency account executive got together just the other day to see if they could agree on some basic approaches to their next year's advertising campaigns. After several hours of putting a lot of divergent ideas on the table, they suddenly realized they had no simple, common base from which to start. Then the marketing manager said, "What is my company really trying to do in this world?" A good many hours later, they had an answer they were both sure was right, and they had boiled it down into easily understandable words. And now, they tell me, they're off and running with more ideas for next year than they know what to do with. For the first time, they both have a clear idea of what they basically have to sell. The bigger and more diverse your company becomes, the tougher it is to remember that once upon a time it had a very simple reason for going into business. Yet that simple reason is the cornerstone of its growth and success, and the bigger your company is today, the sounder that reason undoubtedly was. Thus, there really isn't any substitute for making sure you know why your company is in business. And once you do know and have clarified your thinking so you can tell anybody why, you'll be pleasantly surprised how much easier it is to advertise your company's products, convincingly and well. Why is your company in business? If you're sure you know and can say why clearly and memorably, sit right down and write an advertisement for any product your company makes. I almost guarantee you'll be very pleased with the results. Thank you, Mr. Decker. Well said as usual. You know, this is really all we need from time to time. A reminder to turn to basic fundamentals, to our beginnings. Think how clean and stripped of absurdity and circumlocution this kind of thinking could make the ads we see and hear. Think how honestly this sort of thinking could cause the ad to strike the eye and the ear. I think Mr. Decker's editorial should be tacked to the wall over the desk of every copywriter and probably every company president. You know, Emerson said one time, they use the superlative of grammar, most perfect, most exquisite, most horrible, not perceiving that superlatives are diminutives and weaken, that the positive is the sinew of speech, the superlative, the fat. This morning in a taxi on my way to the office, I experienced a curious sensation. For no particular reason, I saw myself in the great city in which I live in relation to future time. As the skyscraper in which I have my offices came into view, I pictured its location 5,000 years from now, after the entire city will have been torn down and rebuilt, perhaps 50 times or more. I saw myself and the teeming thousands on the street as ancients living in a distant and barbaric past, as we will appear in the ancient history books, if they still use books 5,000 years from now. I saw us as we are today, as the ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians must have seen themselves just a short 2,000 or so years ago. Surely the Egyptians of 5,000 years ago felt that their society had reached its virtual peak. The Great Pyramid of Cheops was built more than 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. The speeding automobiles, trains, and airplanes in which we ride today will be as rude and ludicrous to our progeny 5,000 years from now as the chariots of the ancients appear to us today. World War II will be as primitive and distant, and to them as ridiculous, as the conquering invaders from Anatolia and the rise of Mycenae, as the legends of Homer are to us today. As we study the Bronze Age, their children and historians will study us, the Atomic Age. They'll shake their heads and smile and look with horror and unbelief upon our antics, our inhumanity, and they'll marvel at our ingenuity, too. Einstein will be as famous then as Archimedes, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton are to us. They'll still read about Thomas Edison and Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln as we read about Plato and Julius Caesar and Alexander. But try to project yourself forward in time 5,000 years, and from that lofty vantage point look back at us here today. With the miracle of your mind, get in your own time machine and move ahead 50 centuries, and try to visualize our world as it will be then. Lean back in your easy chair of the year, let's round it out, the year 7000, and from that place in time view your present problems. Look at the way you're doing things, the way you're raising the kids and doing your job. Look at the petty problems that beset you now, the things you're worrying about today. They'll have a tendency to fade right out. And while you're at it, try to imagine what the schools will be like, the homes and clothes. Will men still work, or will machines do all the work while men amuse themselves? Who will win the pennant in the American League in the year 7000? Or will baseball be extinct along with the hydrogen bomb, a means of warfare inconceivable to men and women 5,000 years from now, as ridiculous and primitive as throwing rocks, as cruel and inhuman a death as by burning at the stake, or being drawn and quartered, or broken on the rack, or impaled? Take a ride to 5,000 years from now and think about it. It's free. By getting 5,000 years ahead of your present problems, they have a way of shrinking in size, don't they? You might also get some good money-making ideas. Thank you.